Welcome to Translano. Hey, there. I'm so glad you're here. This is a space where we celebrate self-expression, individuality, and empowerment. I want to start by saying something plainly, because it frames everything that comes after. The hardest part of figuring out who I was didn't come from clothes themselves, it came from secrecy, from fear, and from the way I learned early on to treat my own curiosity like evidence of wrongdoing. For a long time I thought the story would sound dramatic if I told it out loud, like it would automatically turn into a spectacle in other people's minds. But when I look back honestly, it wasn't a spectacle. It was a slow, human process of trying to understand myself while also learning how to respect other people, how to repair what I broke, and how to stop confusing shame with morality. I grew up in a house where roles were unspoken but strict. Nobody gave speeches about what boys or girls were supposed to be, but the air had its own rules. My father was practical and quiet, the kind of man who fixed things without talking much. My mother ran the household with a mix of warmth and efficiency, always busy, always caring, always tired. And my sister, a few years older than me, seemed to move through the world with a confidence I didn't understand. She wasn't perfect or angelic. She could be sharp, stubborn, and sometimes cruel in that older sibling way. But she had a social ease that felt like a language I hadn't learned. As a kid, I was sensitive in ways I didn't have words for. I noticed tone and tension before I understood why adults were upset. I felt embarrassment like it was a physical sensation. I learned early that praise came easiest when I performed normal correctly. If I liked the sports my father liked, I was safe. If I laughed at the jokes boys were supposed to laugh at, I blended in. And when I didn't, I learned to hide the difference instead of exploring it. My first memories of being drawn to feminine things weren't sexual, and that's important enough to repeat. They were about texture, about color, about what it looked like to move through the world with softness and intention. I remember being fascinated by the way my sister could put herself together, not because it made her more valuable, but because it looked like a kind of agency. She could choose a look and become it, while I felt like I was wearing whatever uniform would keep me from being noticed. There were small moments that should have been harmless. Once, during a family gathering, the adults were distracted and kids were running everywhere. I wandered into my sister's room because it was quieter. The room smelled like her shampoo and whatever sweet spray she used. On her dresser were hair clips and little accessories, things that looked like they had stories. I picked up a hairband and stretched it between my fingers. I remember thinking, with a child's blunt clarity, that it was unfair that some people got to have beautiful things without anyone calling them weird. I put it down and left, and nobody knew. But I knew. I felt like I'd stepped near a line. As I got older, that line became the center of my mental map. In middle school and early high school, everything felt like surveillance. Boys policed each other constantly, not always with direct insults, but with the threat of them. The message was simple: don't be the wrong kind of different. I became good at reading the room, good at making myself small emotionally while looking normal on the outside. Inside, though, I felt split. I didn't feel like a girl, and I didn't feel like a boy in the way the boys around me seemed to. I felt like a person trying to memorize a script. Around that time, I started experiencing what I would later recognize as anxiety. It wasn't the kind that always looks obvious. It was the kind that makes you overthink every sentence you say. The kind that makes you replay interactions like evidence in a trial. And as my body changed and the social expectations tightened, the curiosity I'd had as a kid turned into something heavier, a need to understand why the idea of presenting differently felt like both relief and danger. I tried to solve myself the way I solved homework problems. I looked for rules. I read random internet forums late at night, the kind of places where people speak with certainty because uncertainty hurts. Some voices insisted it meant I was broken. Others insisted it meant I belonged to a category I didn't fully understand. I bounced between those extremes like a pinball. And because I didn't have anyone safe to talk to, I started to treat secrecy as the price of survival. There were years where nothing happened outwardly. I graduated. I went through the motions. I smiled in pictures. I did what I was supposed to do. But inwardly I carried a constant low-grade dread, that someone would notice something about me that I hadn't even named, and that the notice would turn into humiliation. Shame is strange like that. It can attach itself not just to actions, but to possibilities. By the time I was in my late teens, I had built a private world in my head where I could imagine what it might feel like to look in the mirror and see something gentler, something that matched the softness I felt but never showed. I didn't imagine it like a fantasy with an ending. I imagined it like a breath. Like taking off a heavy jacket you didn't realize you'd been wearing. The first time I actually acted on that curiosity in a tangible way, it wasn't brave. It wasn't empowering. It was quiet, impulsive, and, in hindsight, ethically wrong. And I need to be honest about that, because part of growing up was learning the difference between understanding myself and excusing myself. It happened when I was home from school for a break. My sister had moved out by then, but she still had some things at our parents' house in boxes and drawers that hadn't been cleared out yet. The house was empty in the afternoon. I remember the light in the hallway, the kind that makes dust visible, and I remember my heart beating too fast for what I was doing. I told myself I was just curious, that it would be quick, that I'd put everything back exactly as it was. I opened a drawer that wasn't mine. I took one small item of clothing that belonged to her. Even writing that sentence makes my stomach tighten, because the truth is I crossed a boundary that wasn't mine to cross. It doesn't matter that I didn't intend harm. It doesn't matter that my feelings were complicated. Consent and privacy don't become optional just because you're confused. In the moment, though, I wasn't thinking in those terms. I was thinking like a person who had been starving emotionally for years and had found a door cracked open. I went to the bathroom, locked the door, and changed. There was no music swelling. No dramatic reveal. Just me, staring at myself in the mirror, feeling a wave of emotions so layered I couldn't separate them: relief, fear, shame, a strange kind of grief, and an immediate panic that I was now doing something unforgivable. The relief was real, and that's what made it so confusing. Something in my shoulders dropped. My face softened. It wasn't about being sexy or getting a thrill. It was about recognizing myself in a way I hadn't expected. And then, almost instantly, the guilt hit like a second wave. I looked at myself and realized that this wasn't just about me. It involved someone else's belongings, someone else's trust, someone else's right to feel safe in her own space. I changed back quickly, folded the item too carefully, like neatness could undo the act. I put it back where I found it. I washed my hands even though my hands weren't dirty in a literal sense, because my mind needed a ritual. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to breathe. That could have been the end of it, a private mistake, a private lesson. But secrecy has gravity. Once you've done something in secret, your mind starts negotiating with itself. I told myself I wouldn't do it again. I meant it. And then, days later, the urge returned, not like lust, but like a craving for calm. Like my brain had found one place where the internal noise stopped. It happened again, and then again. Each time, the guilt grew. Each time, my fear of being found out grew. And each time, I became more skilled at pretending nothing was happening. I lived in two worlds, the public world where I was polite, quiet, and fine, and the private world where I was wrestling with a question I couldn't even ask out loud. The consequences didn't arrive as lightning. They arrived as a small, ordinary conversation that changed my life. My sister came home for a weekend visit. We were all in the kitchen at different times, moving around each other, making coffee, talking about nothing. At some point, she went upstairs to grab something. I didn't think about it until I heard her voice from the top of the stairs, not yelling, but tight, like a string pulled too hard. She asked if I'd been in her things. My first reaction was denial, immediate and instinctive. My chest went cold. I started to say no before I'd even formed the words. But something in her tone stopped me. It wasn't accusation for drama's sake. It was a boundary being named. It was the sound of someone realizing their privacy might have been violated. In that second, I felt the full weight of what I'd done. Not in abstract. In real human terms. I saw, in my mind, how it would feel to realize someone had been in my space, touching my belongings, trying on something intimate. I saw how vulnerable that would feel. And I realized I had turned my own pain into someone else's discomfort. I wish I could say I confessed cleanly, with courage. I didn't. I stammered. I tried to explain too much at once. I tried to make her understand before I even took responsibility. It came out messy. I said I was confused. I said I didn't know why I did it. I said I didn't mean to disrespect her. And then, finally, I said yes. Her face changed in a way I'll never forget. It wasn't disgust, not exactly. It was betrayal mixed with shock. She was silent for a long moment, and that silence felt like the true consequence, the kind you can't argue with. She told me, and very clearly, that what I did wasn't okay. She said it didn't matter what my reasons were, she had a right to her space. She asked if I'd taken anything. I told her I hadn't taken anything permanently, but even as I said it I knew it sounded like a technicality, like I was trying to reduce harm by redefining it. She didn't accept that. She shouldn't have. What happened next was not cinematic. It was adult and uncomfortable. She told our mother, because she didn't feel she could carry it alone. My mother looked at me with confusion and a kind of sadness that wasn't anger but wasn't softness either. My father got quiet in the way he always did when emotion got complicated, as if he were trying to find the correct tool for a problem that didn't have one. That weekend felt endless. There were conversations, pauses, doors closing, the feeling of being a stranger in your own home. My sister avoided me for hours at a time. When she did speak to me, it was direct and controlled. She wasn't trying to punish me, she was protecting herself. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I had a choice. I could cling to shame and turn it into defensiveness, or I could accept that shame was not the same thing as accountability. Shame says, I am bad and therefore I must hide. Accountability says, I did something wrong and therefore I must make it right. I apologized to my sister. Not once, not in a dramatic speech, but multiple times, and not with explanations first. I told her I understood I violated her privacy. I told her she didn't owe me forgiveness. I offered to replace anything she felt uncomfortable keeping. I offered, importantly, to stop making my identity question her problem. She didn't forgive me immediately. And that was one of the first mature lessons I had to accept. An apology is not a transaction. You don't insert remorse and receive absolution on schedule. Sometimes the person you hurt needs time. Sometimes the relationship changes permanently. Sometimes you have to live with the knowledge that you damaged something precious. In the weeks after she left, the house felt different. My parents didn't bring it up often, but the silence had a new shape. I felt watched, not because they were monitoring me actively, but because I was monitoring myself. Every time I walked past my sister's old room, my throat tightened. At the same time, a strange clarity arrived. The secret was no longer fully secret. The worst fear I'd carried, the fear of being found out, had come true in a way, and yet I was still alive. I was still here. The world hadn't ended. But the cost was real, I had hurt someone I loved. That's when I finally did something responsible. I asked for help. Not from the internet, not from anonymous comments, not from self-punishment. I asked my mother if I could talk to a counselor. I didn't give her a perfect explanation. I told her I was struggling with anxiety, that I was confused about myself, that I didn't want to keep living in secrecy, and that I needed someone neutral. She hesitated, then nodded, and the relief I felt in that moment was almost painful. Therapy didn't give me instant answers. It gave me language. It gave me the ability to sit with uncertainty without turning it into a crisis. My therapist didn't treat crossdressing like a joke or a scandal. She asked questions about my history, my stress, my family dynamics, my sense of self. She asked what I felt when I presented one way versus another. She asked what I feared. She asked what I wanted my life to look like in 5 years, not in terms of a label, but in terms of peace. One of the most important things she taught me was the difference between exploration and compulsion. Exploration is a choice you can make with respect and care. Compulsion is when you use something as the only way to regulate your emotions, until it starts controlling you. I realized I had been using secrecy like a drug. The private ritual wasn't just about clothing, it was about escaping the pressure of being someone I wasn't sure I could be. We also talked about boundaries, because my story had already proven how essential they were. I had to face the fact that my identity exploration had been entangled with harm because I didn't handle it responsibly. The lesson wasn't don't explore. The lesson was explore without stealing, without lying, without making someone else pay for your fear. So I made a plan. A simple, grown-up plan that I should have made from the beginning. If I wanted to try different presentations, I would do it with my own clothing, in my own space, and without secrecy that depended on violating someone else's privacy. That meant saving money, buying a few basic items that felt authentic to me, and keeping them stored respectfully. It also meant that if I felt overwhelmed, I would talk to my therapist instead of sneaking around. The first time I bought something for myself, I was shaking. Not because the act was wrong, but because it felt like stepping out of the invisible cage I built. I remember standing in a store aisle, looking at ordinary clothing that thousands of people buy every day, and feeling like I was doing something criminal. That's how powerful social conditioning can be. It can make innocence feel like danger. I paid and left quickly, like someone might chase me. But when I got home, I held the bag and felt something new, not excitement exactly, but ownership. Responsibility. The feeling of saying, this is mine, and therefore I'm accountable for how I use it. Over time, I learned how to be honest with myself without turning every emotion into a crisis. Some days I felt comfortable presenting in a more traditionally masculine way. Other days I felt calmer and more me, presenting more femininely in private. I started to understand that identity isn't always a binary switch. For some people it is, and they know clearly who they are. For others, like me, it was more like learning the range of my own voice. I also learned to watch my mental health carefully. When I was stressed, my urge to retreat into secrecy increased. When I was lonely, I was more likely to see my exploration as the only place I could be real. That was a warning sign. I needed more sources of support, not more hiding. That's when I found a small support group, not a sensationalized space, not a place built around shock or performance, but a quiet community centered on gender expression and mental health. The first meeting I attended, I barely spoke. I just listened. People shared stories that sounded like mine in emotional texture even if the details differed. Some were trans. Some were non-binary. Some were men who enjoyed feminine expression and had no desire to change their gender. Some were still figuring it out. What united them was not a costume, but honesty. Hearing their stories didn't give me a new label to cling to. It gave me empathy, including empathy for my younger self. I could look back and see that I wasn't evil as a teenager, I was scared. But empathy for myself didn't erase the need to make amends. It just kept me from drowning in self-hatred. The hardest relationship to repair was with my sister. For months, we kept things polite. We talked about normal sibling topics, work, plans, family updates. But there was a wall. I could feel it. And I knew I'd built it. Eventually, I asked her if we could talk privately. Not because I wanted closure like a movie ending, but because I wanted to respect her as a whole person, not just someone in my story. We sat in a coffee shop, the kind of public place where voices stay calm because other people are nearby. My hands were cold even though the cup was warm. I told her I wanted to apologize again, without excuses. I told her I'd been in therapy. I told her I was learning about boundaries. I told her that my confusion didn't justify what I did. Then I told her, gently, that I was still exploring my gender expression, and that I didn't expect her to understand it immediately, but I wanted her to know the truth so she wouldn't imagine something worse. She listened without interrupting. And then she surprised me. She said something like, I wish you had told me you were struggling, but I also know you probably didn't feel like you could. She said she had spent weeks after the incident wondering if I'd been making fun of her, or if it was something darker. She said that the lack of context had made it feel even more violating. Hearing that hurt, because it was another consequence I hadn't fully seen. When you hide, other people fill the silence with their worst guesses. She didn't suddenly become my guide or my cheerleader. That wasn't her job. But she did something generous. She acknowledged my humanity. She said she still needed time to rebuild trust. She set clear boundaries. She said she didn't want her belongings involved ever again. I agreed immediately. I told her I would respect that completely. As we talked, another truth emerged. My sister had her own struggles with identity and social pressure, just in different forms. She told me about moments she'd felt unsafe, about being judged for how she looked, about the constant evaluation girls and women endure. It hit me then that my story was not separate from hers. Gender expectations hurt everyone, just in different ways. The goal wasn't for me to step into her world without permission. The goal was for me to build a world where both of us could breathe. After that conversation, things improved slowly. Not perfectly. Real life doesn't do perfect. But we had more honesty. When the topic came up, it wasn't a bomb anymore. It was a serious subject we could handle with care. My parents took longer. My mother asked hesitant questions, the kind that reveal concern and love mixed with fear. Would I be bullied? Was I confused because of trauma? Was this a phase? I learned to answer patiently, because I realized her questions were not attacks, they were the language she had available. My father didn't ask much, but he started doing small things that, for him, meant acceptance. He stopped making jokes about real men, he stopped pressuring me into activities that felt performative, and one day he said, quietly, I don't always understand, but I want you to be okay. Coming from him, that was a whole paragraph. As I moved into adulthood, the question of identity became less about what I wore and more about how I lived. It became about integrity. Could I be honest without being reckless? Could I seek comfort without using secrecy as a weapon? Could I handle other people's reactions without collapsing into shame or lashing out? There were times I didn't handle it well. I told a friend once, thinking it would be fine, and they reacted with awkward laughter that stung more than anger would have. I dated someone who said they were open-minded but then treated my feelings like a novelty. I learned that not everyone deserves your vulnerability, and that discernment is not the same as hiding. Discernment is choosing safe people. Hiding is choosing isolation. I also learned practical coping strategies, because identity exploration without emotional tools can become chaos. I kept a journal, not to write dramatic entries, but to track patterns. What triggered my anxiety, what helped me feel grounded, what situations made me feel like I had to perform. I practiced simple mindfulness, not as a trend, but as a way to notice when shame was starting to hijack my thoughts. I exercised, not to be more masculine, but to be in my body in a way that felt respectful and present. And when I felt the urge to do something secretive or impulsive, I learned to pause and ask myself, what am I actually needing right now? Often the answer wasn't clothes. It was rest. It was reassurance. It was connection. It was permission to be imperfect. Over time, I began to integrate. Integration, for me, didn't mean choosing one presentation forever. It meant letting my external choices align with my internal values. It meant I could enjoy softness without turning it into a shameful secret. It meant I could still show up for responsibilities, work, relationships, family, without feeling like I was acting in a play. It meant I could look back at my younger self with compassion and still hold him accountable, which is a surprisingly mature form of love. Sometimes people ask, so what are you, exactly? And I understand the question, because labels help people organize reality. But I've stopped treating that question like a demand. The most honest answer I can give is that I'm someone who explored gender expression through crossdressing as a way of understanding myself, and who learned, painfully and gradually, that self-discovery has to be paired with respect. I'm someone who made a real mistake by crossing my sister's boundaries, and who had to earn back trust through consistent behavior, not dramatic apologies. I'm someone who learned that the goal isn't to be scandalous or to be normal, but to be truthful, responsible, and kind. If you're listening to this and you recognize pieces of yourself in it, I want to offer a few things I wish someone had told me earlier. Your curiosity doesn't automatically make you dangerous. But secrecy can make you behave in ways that don't match your values. If you're exploring, do it ethically. Don't take what isn't yours. Don't violate privacy. Don't let your fear turn you into someone you don't want to be. Find safe, professional support if you can, because confusion is not a character flaw, but unmanaged shame can become a habit that harms you and others. And remember that the people around you are not props in your identity journey. They're full people with their own boundaries, histories, and vulnerabilities. The older I get, the more I understand that identity is not something you solve and then never think about again. It's something you live. It's something you negotiate with the world and with yourself. And if you do it with honesty, humility, and respect, it can become a source of strength rather than fear. I'm not telling this story to be seen as brave. I'm telling it because silence breeds misunderstanding, and misunderstanding breeds cruelty, and I don't want my early mistakes to be the only chapter anyone hears about. The real chapter is what came after: learning, apologizing, rebuilding, and becoming someone I can live with in the quiet moments when nobody is watching. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.